body, mind, and soul in the upright position. We hope you enjoy the ride.
Welcome to WAYSPACE. This is it. Here we are. Let's be here now. Episode 5. Oh my God. Last week was a doozy. I've still been reflecting on it and thinking about it and all the murkiness and all that good stuff. I don't have too much to say about it in reflection, actually. I think I'm sort of just recognizing the truth of it, particularly the part that I was talking about where you move to new states and inevitably that's just going to happen. That certainly happened. And then I went back into the murkiness and then I came out again. So I don't know all the ways that I'll eventually one day reflect on that kind of thing, but I certainly think it was really valuable for me to dive into it and to talk about what I was experiencing in that way. I think going forward, I'm definitely not going to shy away from just recording a podcast anyway, regardless of really how I'm doing. I mean, I don't want to go overboard, but even if I'm in a murky state or not doing so hot or whatever, I'm really glad to just show up and be here. And based on what y'all said about sort of how it affected you, I'm so glad that it resonated, So here we are, episode 5, and I have some things I have in mind that I want to talk about today. But I also, in this sort of intro section, I want to talk about my sort of plans for not necessarily a reading list, but basically an answer to what some of you have been talking about. And I really appreciate any input that you give me in the podcast. I mean, certainly I'm just going to do what I want and express however I need to express and let come out whatever's going to come out. But at the same time, hearing about what stands out to you and what feels good to you is huge. I mean, I love that because it also shows me what's important to me too, the way that I hear what different people say about what they think about the podcast. It reminds me what I got out of and what I still get out of listening to podcasts, particularly podcasts like this. So here's my plan. I'm going to post a reading list / listening list because a lot of these books I've listened to onto the Patreon. And so it's going to be sort of a thing where it's like, if you want access to it, you kind of got to be on the Patreon. That being said, though, I'm going to mention some of them right now just because I also want it to be accessible. But I'll give like the full, I wrote down like a list of books that I feel like I've come back to over the last 1.5 to 2 years. And so in that respect, I'm going to post the list. And then what I'm thinking right now, this might change, but what I want to do then is if somebody is interested in hearing more about my own experience about a particular book and how valuable it is, it may turn into a podcast episode, but that depends more on how I'm really feeling and if I feel like I could do a whole episode on a particular book or something, which I probably could. But what I want to do is set it up so that if you want to hear about a particular book or you have a question about it, or you're like, Jack, why this book? What did it do for you? I'm going to have like special Patreon only episodes where I'll talk for like 10, 15 minutes or something like that, or longer or shorter, about a particular book. So here's the list that I have. So, and this is sort of in order, chronological order, and also sort of thematically in order in a particular way. But basically going from sort of the beginning of what I can remember as being my like foray, is that the word? Foray into my spiritual practice. It began really with the Tao Te Ching. Taoism is a for whatever reason, it was a way that my sort of atheistic tendency felt like it could not, like my mind that was so attached to being atheistic or agnostic. I mean, in some ways I'm still agnostic, but atheistic in particular, the Tao Te Ching sort of like worked around that, I feel like, and sort of was a little bit too mystically like confusing to my atheistic ego mind. And so because of that, it was a really great entryway into my spiritual practice. And from there, I sort of got like 365 Tao by Deng Tao, which I've like even quoted before, I think on the first episode. And then there's a book called The Tao of Physics. And so again, I'm going to be listing all of these on the Patreon page. And then of course there's like Ram Dass and Be Here Now and some other things. And then there's also, I think a lot of people have heard about this book before. It's called The Power of Now, and it's by Eckhart Tolle or Tolle. The reason I think that that's such a great book for any spiritual practitioner, any spiritual seeker, any mystical person to read is because it's really helpful in reminding you that anything that you experience in terms of your spiritual practice ultimately can be accessed and almost translated to the contemporary world. Not to say that it should be. I think that spiritual practices and particularly traditions should be able to have the depth to the inner experience and experiencing the tradition from the inside out. But we live in a society, we live in a world, we live in a sort of functioning amalgamation of relationships in which not everybody is going to come from the same spiritual tradition, particularly in the United States and just the Western world. We have so many choices and so many things going on. And I think books like The Power of Now can be really, really helpful in terms of having sort of a solid foundation that is based in words and understandings that are harmonious with the scientific mind. Because I think science is a part of science is this era's spiritual practice in some ways. Our spiritual tradition is science in many ways. I could go into more of that and thinking about more of that, but all that to say is I think it's a great book for bringing things into harmony. Now, that being said, I know a lot of people that was the book that opened them up, and that's huge. That's pretty amazing because it gives you an understanding of the language so that you're not so hung up on any particular religious or spiritual terms per se, and you sort of think of it just in terms of bringing consciousness to things and presence and, the sort of the ways that Eckhart Tolle talks about things. So I found that to be really helpful. The books after that I've really loved, certainly The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. That's huge, particularly for artists, but really for anybody because we're all creators, creative people. We're all creators. We create things, and it's just a matter of appreciating how we do it. The other books that I'm going to mention quickly before I kind of move on from this intro and talk about sort of the protein of the podcast is Ramana Maharshi Be As You Are, which is basically a Q&A sort of amalgamation of chapters and of understandings that Ramana Maharshi, who is sort of like a guru in, I forget exactly what time period, I believe it was the early 1900s, early mid-1900s. He was sort of similar to Eckhart Tolle. He had just a moment of an awakening experience and his ego dissolved. And at that point, he had full sort of identification with the capital S self, with God, with universal consciousness, however you want to think about it. Ultimate presence, totally in the moment, whatever, however you like to use to understand full awakening. And similar to Eckhart Tolle, who had an experience similar to that when he had a mental breakdown. Ramana Maharshi thought he was dying as a teenager, I think at 15 or 16. And he let himself die, basically, but his body didn't actually die. And so then at that point, he accepted his own death then and there, rather than having to wait till the end of his life to do it. And so that kind of culminated in a particular awakening experience. And he had many texts, I guess, that came out of his existence, but many of his teachings were silent teachings, and the students' own perceptions were, he kind of just allowed the students' own perceptions to unfold what was going to unfold and awaken them. And this book, Be As You Are, is sort of that in a book. And it begins with the most direct, straightforward, obvious, kind of literal way of doing it. And then it gets more and more complex as you go through the book. And so I haven't even made my way all the way through because I've been so focused on the first part of the book, but it's so good. So then after that is this book called The Holy Science by Sri Ukdesoir. And that I love because it's sort of, he gets into sort of the yugas, which are sort of the periods of time in which basically humans exist as humans, as God, as whatever, and awaken at different times. And I don't want to go too far into it. One, because I have more to understand about it. I've certainly listened to the book on audiobook several times and worked through it. And I kind of understand the way that the yugas work and how it's related. But I think it's the kind of thing where it's best if you just experience it. And then if you're curious about what I think about it, I can, certainly add to it. And then after that, Neville Goddard, The Power of Awareness, that's huge for me. I mean, a lot of Neville Goddard talks and things I love, but The Power of Awareness is a text that is built on his talks. And it was from transcriptions of his talks. And I really love it because that was sort of my entryway into Christian mysticism. So yeah, it went from like the Tao Te Ching, which was like, okay, maybe I don't have to be super atheistic and I can lean into a little bit of faith somehow here and there, to really into Christian mysticism at the end where I'm at now. And not to say I'm not still listening to the Tao Te Ching or reading it or whatever. I'm now kind of using whatever spiritual practices and mystical understandings help me in my spiritual path. I think where I've incarnated to is it has me in a place where I am ready and able and willing to expose myself to the different ways in which I can awaken, and different parts of my consciousness need different kinds of things to awaken. So you might have something like, like the way Ram Dass talks in Be Here Now, which was like the first, 5 years of his awakening process when he had another, 45 years to go in his lifetime and his incarnation. But Be Here Now, a lot of it is about turning yourself into sort of a burning incarnation where you burn off all your karma and get rid of your attachments. And then later Ram Dass is not so hung up on that, it's a little more relaxed and understanding that whatever you're dealing with, including your desires, is a part of your incarnation. So I have a lot of different ways in which different things have been helpful to me, because you then get to like Neville Goddard's The Power of Awareness. And it is about not just desires, but the sacred aspect of your desires, that they're gifts from God and that you use them in order to awaken. So there's a whole array of different ways in order to awaken. And what I love about sort of the way that my path has gone is that I am in a place where having all these different things that seem like they don't go together, it shows you what is underlying, which is that they are all getting you to the same mountaintop. And this is a metaphor that I feel like has been used in a bunch of different traditions, which is that we're all climbing the same mountain. We're all, as Ram Dass talks about, walking each other home. And the question is, do you like this path better? Do you like this path better? Do you like climbing on the rocks a little bit more dangerously? Do you like just walking in a calm, relaxed incline that takes a bit longer but is more relaxing? There are all different ways to do it. And I'm kind of in a place where you experiment. I've been experimenting the last year and a half of which ways I find to be most helpful. And what happens is you kind of get to a point where you start to create your own religious practice. And that's sort of the nomadic way of going about one's spiritual practice, really. And yeah, and so now it's been like 15 minutes of me talking about this reading list. So if you want to hear more about any of these particular books, or any other books that I've read, or if you're like, Jack, I'm reading this one and it's amazing, I would be totally down to, do some kind of Patreon episode or whatever. Or maybe if I'm super into a book, then I'll just make a whole episode about it. That's definitely going to happen at some point, doing almost like reports on different books. But I have more. There are more books that I've read that I'm currently reading that are really helpful to me. So I'll talk more about that, and that'll be in the reading list on the Patreon. All right. So the protein of today's episode is not much different from me talking about this reading list. It's actually very involved, and in some ways, making the reading list and thinking about the reading list got me to a place where I really wanted to talk about this in sort of a, I guess, reflective way. And I'm glad to be able to kind of go through this reading list to kind of prime myself for it, which is, what is spiritual practice? How do I define it? How did I even get to this place where I have a practice? Like, what the fuck is that? You know? And what is it like to adapt it into like our societal understanding of spiritual practice? Like, what is it like for me with my own practice to be absorbed into this society's definition of spiritual practice? Because it's, in terms of the sort of Western contemporary world, it's been around for a bit. And how do I think about my practice now from where it was when it began? All right. So, what is spiritual practice? To me, spiritual practice is about, and it is, the ways in which you adjust, manage, conversate with your relationship to reality. It is a way in which you adjust yourself to said reality. And what I sort of mean by that is that it has to do with not so much what reality is. Certainly that's fun, but it has more to do with your relationship to this reality. So, in my case, I have a bunch of different practices that modulate the way in which I experience the world, experience myself, experience what I call reality. Part of why I say reality is because I think reality is like a malleable term, and I think throughout spiritual practice, it's good to be able to recognize the malleability of a lot of these terms that I know in my life I've taken for granted. So, for example, if I am tripping on acid, right, and I'm meditating at the same time, and I'm deep in meditation, my relationship to reality is modulated a lot. It's so adjusted and modulated that the question of what reality is becomes not necessarily insignificant, but the line between me and reality changes. It falls away. And so when I say relationship to reality, it then becomes more about this interplay, this relationship between one aspect of an existence to another aspect of an existence, rather than it being Jack's relationship to the world or Jack's relationship to reality. And so that's sort of what I mean by relationship. It really is about how do we understand the stuff that's at play. The sort of, I'm going to take it into like metaphorical territory now because it gets pretty difficult, I feel like, to just get it into one set of terms, which is something that I've really loved, which is the like waves in an ocean. So, for example, I as Jack am a wave and God is the ocean. And so when we're thinking about Jack as the wave, is the wave not the ocean? The wave is the ocean, absolutely. And the way of sort of understanding that I am both the wave and the ocean at the same time and experiencing that to my core, that is spiritual practice. Spiritual practice is adjusting one's actual lived, literal life experience to understand these, what seem like mystical metaphorical terms. That none of these mystical metaphorical terms, spiritual terms, religious terminology are, in my mind, meant to be abstract. They are here to show us literally what's going on if we are able to get past the fact that they are supposed to appear just as metaphors. And what that means is a spiritual practice that gets you into the subjective experience by using objective means. So, what do I mean by like objective means? So this was something that I wrote about on my morning pages today. And oh boy, hopefully this is all making sense. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. If you have any questions about kind of like where my head's going, feel free to ask, particularly like in the Patreon. I'll like, clarify by just recording something or whatever, you know what I mean? Because I'm definitely going into territory that's kind of new for me, but this is kind of the point of the podcast, so I'm kind of excited about it. But so yeah, so in my pages today, I was thinking about the way that my relationship to reality works using my spiritual practice, and how, so for example, when I'm in meditation, when like sitting meditation, I've got a cushion in my room. I've got a little altar with the cover of Be Here Now, with a sort of a page out of Be Here Now. These are all sort of like fabric that's like tapestry like things. I think they're called prayer flags, at least when I got them. And it says you're standing on a bridge watching yourself go by, and then there's like a cushion with a blanket and a pillow. And it's looked that way, for the last probably year and a half at least. And my sort of practice is that when I get up in the morning after I do my morning pages, I move over to this seat, I sit down, I close my eyes, I say a little bit of like a meditation in my head to ease myself into letting go of what I got to let go of. And then I go into meditation and either count my breaths and focus on the counting, or I just do sort of a Vipassana style where I just breathe and I let everything come to me. And I kind of occupy this sitting position, both physically and in my mind. And all of these different things, all of these objective things, like the objective experience of looking at the prayer flags, the objective experience of sitting on the cushion, of folding the pillow over so it gives me a nice place to sit, of putting one leg over the other, all these different things, of even the focusing on my breathing, all of these different things are objective aspects of my experience that in my spiritual practice I see as pointing to the subjective aspect of my experience. So, what is the subjective aspect of my experience? In one sense, the more I try to talk about it, the less understandable it is, but there is a way in which I can sort of, at least in my pages, I found able to use the way that I was talking about the objective experience, which I just went through, to explain the subjective experience, which is that what all of these practices do, like when I sit down and all these little moments leading up to my meditation do, is they prime me. They sort of alert my body, which actually is alerting my awareness that it's time to let go. And the letting go, what my awareness, what my consciousness, what my ego does, all these, whatever, however you want to think about it, because it's all kind of the same in this kind of circumstance. What happens is this letting go that happens, that is the subjective experience. And I say letting go because I have to use objective terminology to describe it, because that's, words are all objective terms, it's the best we've got for communication. And so hopefully you can understand what I'm saying underneath all these words, which is that there's this letting go that happens that, to say, is it because I sit down on the cushion and I focus on my breaths? I don't know if it's necessarily because of that. And I say that because over time, it's felt like within spiritual practice, the practices point you to the subjective experience that is available to you at all times. And when I say you, I mean me. This is my own experience. And so, I have practices where it feels like my subjective experience and the adjustment that happens when I talk about in spiritual practice, it's about your relationship to reality. The modulation of my relationship to reality will happen even if I don't do those objective practices of the meditation. That being said, it's super important to do it because I'm in a place where it's very helpful, but it's not the end all be all. It's not the the whole point. The whole point is the subjective experience change. And that, for me, is something that I've been reflecting on, particularly since last week's episode, because I sort of like, I came back to like certain texts and talks and things that I hadn't sort of looked at in probably like a year, maybe 9 months. And I remembered, oh yeah, this is not about subscribing only to one particular practice. This is about understanding how they're all talking about the same thing. They don't have to be. You can experience them all as different, and that can be really fun. But I found what's most helpful to me and what kind of propels me along this path is recognizing that they're all talking about the same thing, because it allows me to have this like really stable stream of my practice that just continues and uses whatever it needs to use in order to awaken at different moments. And that's a sort of trust and faith in the stream of the practice. Okay, so I want to talk about so I talked about sitting meditation, right? I want to talk about another practice that I do that sort of, I think, exemplifies even better what I mean by sort of the objective versus subjective way of experiencing one's spiritual practice, and I guess how what I'm going to talk about, modulates my relationship to reality. So the other thing that I do is, it's in many ways also a meditation. It's sort of a concentration meditation in some ways, but not always. It kind of depends. But basically what I have is a chant. Some people, like a lot of people, do mantra, but for whatever reason, I think it's because I wanted a mantra. I tried different mantras and things in my head that were like Buddhist or whatever, different things that were sort of more like monotone like. But at a certain point, I just found my heart opening to a particular chant that comes from Hindu traditions, and the chant is sort of like, acts as a mantra, but it's just with a melody. And so it's in my head at all times, basically, for the most part. And what I did is I would sing it out loud. I would sing it while I was in the shower. I would sing it at different times. And there were several moments and occurrences in my life when I would be singing it and singing along to a track or something, and my heart really would open. Objectively speaking, I would just be bursting into tears. I would feel this tug of just feeling like I'm safe, but also at the same time, like I'm able to experience my pain. There's so many ways to describe it, but in any sense, it's opened my heart several times, where now it's like there's this golden thread to my heart opening and my self-awakening with this particular chant. And this kind of thing is different for everybody. I don't even think that everybody would, benefit from using some kind of like audiation that they're doing in their head in order to do this. But I found for me, it's so helpful. I mean, it makes sense. I make music, particularly lyrics and vocals. So of course, doing something like this where I'm performing to myself basically is part of my spiritual practice. And so what this does is there is, in some ways, particularly because most of the time I'm doing this silently, and, I can feel it in the back right now. It's like I'm talking here, but in the back of my experience, if I just allow it for a second, it's going. It's sort of like, it's hard to explain, but this is something that I've really learned a lot from Ram Dass and the way that he talked about it. And I think it has to do with not just the fact that he did it so seriously, but also that he was sort of this Western person with a Western mindset that could explain it in these terms that another Westerner like me could understand. And I don't use what he used in his talks. I use my own thing that I kind of discovered, but it's also like very much so from him and from, just singing that I've heard different people do. And it was just like one track that I found on YouTube somewhere and was like, oh my God, this is, I was just singing along to it once and it became so easy to sing. And it just opened me and opened me and opened me. And so because of that, it's like, that's the experience. And that was a subjective experience that happened to me. The feeling of opening it's so difficult to explain in objective terms. I mean, I can try by saying like I started crying or I felt this tug in my chest, but it's a subjective experience that in many ways in relationship to myself only I have access to. And that's why I use this particular chant in my head as part of my spiritual practice. And it keeps me in a place where not only does it keep me present and sort of alert and coming back to this understanding of myself, but it also brings me back to an understanding of my relationship to reality, like I was saying earlier. And that's why it's such a valuable spiritual practice to me, and why I have no need to let go of it. I mean, letting go of it would probably be a beautiful thing, in the same way that being able to let go of sitting meditation would be a beautiful thing, because I would be able to be like meditating all the time. But do I need to be in a rush to do that, to be all like perfectly present? No, because it's fun to go in and out and, ride the waves and all that kind of stuff. So, the one thing I wanted to add about the chant that I have in my head is, and that aspect of the practice is that it sort of, I talked about this in my pages. It sort of works like, imagine I've got this like golden thread in my awareness, you could say. Or if you want to think about it, let's talk about it like it's physical. Let's say that I've got this golden thread that isn't like taped to my body or anything, but it's sort of like wrapped around my arm and it's attached to a balloon, right? So the thread is not literally attached to me. Like it's moving on its own, but it is like wrapped around me. So it's not like the balloon is just going to float away, that this golden thread is attached to, right? The balloon is kind of with me pretty much at all times. Now, because the golden thread is not literally attached to me, it's not like taped to my arm or something. It is not like, I'm not like necessarily annoyed by it. It's not something that I feel at all times. It's just, if I look for it, oh, it's there. It's definitely there. If I look at my arm to see if the golden thread is attached, it's there. And what happens is, if I focus on the golden thread and I actually wrap my hand around it and hold on, and I let go a little bit, the balloon starts to take me up. And I start to ascend a little bit. And then what happens is, maybe I get into a situation where I have to think about this. I start to get overwhelmed. I start to have to do these things. I'm stressed out about this. That stuff makes it so that I'm not quite as, letting go with the thread, and I start to weigh myself back down. And so what the chant is it's this golden thread attached to a balloon. You could say the balloon in this metaphor is like ascendance, or going deeper in. It doesn't have to be like ascendance, like hierarchically speaking. I kind of just mean like a floating, spacious, lighter way of experiencing reality, which could also be associated with a deeper inner experience of reality. So this golden thread is attached to that experience of reality. And when I'm doing this chant, or allowing this chant to just exist, and I'm focused on that, it sort of takes me in that direction if I allow it to. And so because of that, there are objective experiences that happen. Like, I could explain the audiation in my head and this repetition of this chant as a, objective experience of, very fine, subtle movements of sound within my head, that kind of a thing. But there's something about the subjective experience that is happening to me that is ineffable. I cannot describe it other than with objective terms. And it's an aspect of floating up, of going in, of sort of recognizing what else is around me. So if I'm caught up in a thought like, oh God, like, ah, shit, like, how am I going to get this song released at this time? And I got to get all the lyrics in there, and they're all in my Logic project, and I don't have them in my notes. So I'm going to have to go into each file and put them in. Like, all these kinds of thoughts of like my ego orchestrating things. A lot of that weighs me down, and it kind of, in some ways, weighs me down. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the only and best way to describe it. It also sort of constricts my awareness. So if you could think about like if you have like a telescope or something, and it constricts your vision, so you're looking at one part at a time, that can be very useful, but it's also limiting at the same time. It's constricting. and constricting, both. and what happens is you could imagine the chant in my head being like, all of a sudden the telescope widens, but doesn't have any less clarity. And so that's sort of that's the way that it works, is like it dilates my awareness in a way that is almost involuntary, because I've put so much of my faith, love, effort, interest, awareness, care into cultivating this aspect of my sort of practice. So that's another example of sort of a way in which my spiritual practice manifests. So how did I come to this practice? I think at a certain point, and I talked about this sort of in like the What's the Point episode, I think you get to a certain point where it's not necessarily that you get bored of, or I didn't get bored of the world and the way in which I was understanding my relationship to reality. But what happened was I got so burnt out that even when I, for example, went in a direction with what I was trying to achieve or do or whatever, it would be a dead end. And I would inevitably turn around and go back a different way and try the same thing again. Not necessarily the same thing, like I was, for example, basketball. I was trying to achieve at basketball. I wanted to be in the NBA. Then I was like, I don't think I'll be tall enough for that. All that kind of self-talk that we have as young teenagers, or whatever time it was for you, if you're into a sport and want to play professionally, and it just, for whatever reason, you saw that it wasn't in the cards for you. And so then I was like, oh, okay, well, that's a dead end. So I'm going to go and try to achieve at skateboarding, and I'm going to be a pro skateboarder. And then I get to a point where I'm like, damn, I still can't tray flip. And so that becomes a little bit of a dead end. And so then I'm like, okay, I guess I'll go another way. And then I find music, and I'm like, oh, I could be a super successful professional rapper, and I'm going to go on tour and make a lot of money and be super successful. And I don't have to be super famous, but I'd like to be famous, that kind of a way of going about it. Like I'm trying to learn from my past dead ends, but I still am trying to do the same thing. And you go through that kind of process where the objective experiences are different. Certainly, this difference between playing basketball and skateboarding and making music, of course, those are different experiences. But my subjective experience of them was in many ways the same. Not to say it was completely the same. Of course, I learn over time, even if I'm not conscious of it. But in many ways, they were the same. And on this third run through of sort of this way of wanting to be super achieve mindset mentality, like super achieve, really just achieve it all and be great and perfect and do it all and make all my bets worth it, that kind of a thing. I get to a point where shit, I'm in my 20s now, and I'm still living off of this kind of narrative, and I can see that it's a dead end. Not that I need to stop music or need to stop playing basketball or need to stop skateboarding. I do them all still. But that the subjective experience was a dead end. The subjective experience of reality that I had was a dead end again and again and again. And so then at this point, and this was about, 2 years ago, and I think, 2 years ago, but then particularly during the pandemic is when I really dove in to my spiritual practice. So this is maybe a little over a year ago. I decided, okay, I can't have any more dead ends. I don't want more dead ends. I want opening. I don't want closing. And, I think now how I came to my spiritual practice is wanting that. I long for no more dead ends. The end of dead ends, And what that ultimately means is I'm yearning for God. I'm yearning for the universal consciousness, to be part of love, to be, subjectively speaking, just a little guy on a big couch, just the biggest couch I can imagine. I just want to be lying on this couch and just relax, and just totally relax and realize I get to lie on this couch and relax and jump around, because it's such a huge couch, forever. I can have fun, I can play, I can rest, I can sleep, all these wonderful subjective experiences and way of understanding things. I yearn for that. I yearn to finally be able to relax. And it doesn't mean I don't want to achieve things, but ultimately, I don't want to be achieving things thinking I need to achieve them. I want to achieve things from this place of being relaxed, like I was already enough. And so when it comes to adapting my sense of spiritual practice into like what I view as society's view of spiritual practice, and this sort of also relates of how I think about my practice now from when I began, is that I can see that what my spiritual practice has manifested as is almost like twofold. In one sense, it really is the end of my dead ends. It is the opening moment, and I can feel it happening. Oh my goodness. I can feel like the rush of goosebumps kind of happening. Ooh. And yeah, that's interesting. So there's a feeling like that's happening, and that now it's just a matter of allowing it all to unfold. However, and this is, I definitely think, as I became more and more open about my spiritual practice to my family, my friends, the world, is that it also started to become almost like the fourth chapter of me trying to achieve something. And I think that's related to the fact that, you know, I'm doing this podcast. This is part of my creative career at this point, making this podcast, clearly. I mean, I've got a Patreon now. I'm talking about this stuff on Twitch when I'm making music or whatever, talking about it with my friends, talking about it in terms of my creative pursuits. So now it's become a part of my lifelong path of different successes and achievements. It's not because I need to achieve, but because like that's the way I'm existing. Like I achieve things. I create projects, finish projects, put them out. You know, it's just the way I'm existing. And so in that respect, there's also this game that I'm sort of playing where my spiritual practice now versus when I began is now not this private thing that is almost inaccessible to my achievement mindset. Now my spiritual practice is accessible to my achievement mindset. And it is up to me to have this balance and harmony between the parts of me that want to achieve and desire success in a big way, and the parts of me that realize that my spiritual practice in many ways is about being and seeing that I am so much more than any achievement that I could embark on, that I am so far beyond that any achievement are just, like I was saying earlier, just waves on the ocean, and that I can remember again and again and again that I am this ocean. And in that respect, I think my practice is much more eclectic now than it was when I started. When I started, it sort of felt like this private thing that was almost like this private hobby that I was sort of feeling like, oh, I can't tell anybody that I do like this chant in my head. I was feeling like nervous about my altar that I have, sort of, you know, my puja area, I sort of have like a puja table and a puja area. It's sort of in different places. It's just how it works for me, at least right now. I'm sure that'll change over time when I move to different places or whatever. But I understand my spiritual practice is something that I don't need to be scared to reveal, because a lot of people are going through similar kinds of experiences as me and find interest in modulating their relationship to reality. And that's what I'm doing. That's the whole point of this, is I'm learning and uncovering aspects of my subjective experience that are way, way more real, way more profound to my life than any objective experiences I could have. And that the objects of my experience are formed by my subjective perceptions. And appreciating that has been a huge part of my spiritual practice and continues to be more and more so, almost like it blows my mind every few months, that kind of a thing. I mean, I come back to the same stuff and I'm like, oh, right. Oh, right. Oh, right. That kind of a thing. So, yeah. I don't think I think about my practice in the way that I did at the beginning. I think my ego, which is in many ways the part of me that's talking right now. I mean, the part of me that's talking right now, this Jack guy, is very much so my ego speaking about all of this stuff. And then there's a part of me behind this, which is sort of just behind the chant, that is watching this and is like, yeah, dude, oh boy, you're really working through this, aren't you? That kind of just noticing it and interest. And the way my ego feels about this is sort of, or my ego mechanism or the ego relationship or the amalgamation of, electric impulses that are happening in my awareness, whatever you want to call it. I like saying the ego sometimes because it can be helpful in giving it a name, even if it doesn't really exist. But certainly it exists in my perception of reality right now. So maybe one day my perception of reality will be that there is no ego. But, I don't think I need to reject the ego at this point. I think I can affirm the existence of the ego insofar as it's helpful to me to move away from it and allow it to kind of dissolve on its own, that kind of a thing, and realize I can be friendly to the parts of me that are scared of loneliness and think about competition and want success and aspire all these things. I think many of these are wonderful things, and it's part of what makes me human. And I think that's a way that my spiritual practice has changed, and how I view it differently is that my spiritual practice has become much more about allowing everything that I experience as a human, including all my past experiences and all the hurt and all the shame and all the suffering that I've either felt myself, felt like I caused, or other people caused me, or whatever, and accepting that it's all part of my life curriculum, my soul's curriculum, and the reason that I'm here. And I'm grateful for that. And over time, I can feel that as I allow more of that, it will dwindle away into lighter and lighter states, so that the states that I occupy will be, just lighter, more spacious. So when I'm really overwhelmed about all this stuff that I have to do, or that I think I have to do, that I perceive that I have to do, that my ego thinks I have to do, it goes from, trudging through the mud to like sliding on the wooden floor in my socks, that kind of a difference. And so, not to say that I shouldn't be careful sliding on the wooden floor in my socks, like I might slip or something, but it is a lighter way of existing. And if I can find my balance there, then it'll remind me that I can always have faith in what I'm doing, in my practice, in myself. All right. Wow. So this has been a pretty fun episode, actually. I hope that it made enough sense. I mean, certainly, I think for folks listening and you who is listening, at a certain point, you start to get the way that my mind is working and the way that I'm talking about things. So you start to be able to follow what you need to follow and let go of what you don't need to. Because the way I talk is certainly not like make sure you get everything I'm saying. It's more like let's just hang out here under this shower of Jack's thoughts coming straight out from his head, stream of consciousness, and just experience it all and see what it's like and see, what comes up for you. What in your life do you think about when you hear me talk about these things? In any of the podcasts, that's a huge thing. I mean, for me, that's why I find, and this I haven't talked about much in my spiritual practice, but as sort of a little epilogue to the protein part before we head out is, this is why I find astrology to be so valuable, why I find tarot to be valuable, not because I believe that astrology is my sort of like religion or my like spiritual backbone or foundation, or that tarot is, but more that what happens is, say I look, and I haven't really looked in a while because I haven't been quite as interested in it for a bit. I've been more interested in other areas of my spiritual practice, but something like the CoStar app or something like that, when you read a horoscope, it is, at least for me, it is an opportunity to see what comes up for me when it tells me that. So regardless of whether it feels correct or completely wrong or whatever, it's more about witnessing my reaction to the way that the astrology horoscope poses a particular fact of my existence. And so, say I get really pissed off about it saying that, you got to be really careful with the way you have your friendships right now and letting people in. And because a lot of the time you have a problem where people find that they can take advantage of you, and I get pissed off about that. What does that say about how I'm perceiving my own experience right now? So it's not to say that that's necessarily correct or incorrect about my experience, but if I get pissed off of seeing that, what does that say about my relationship to how I think about myself? And so that is kind of what I mean by the difference between the objective experience of it saying, you got to be careful with your friends, and me saying, no, I don't. That's okay. If it's wrong, then it's wrong. But the subjective experience is something presents something to me that feels incorrect, and it makes me angry at it. The subjective experience of that is recognizing that I have some tenderness, whether it's because it's correct and I'm angry because it's actually telling me something that's right about my experience, or that I've heard that shit so many times and I'm tired of it, and it's time for me to let go of having that understanding of my friendships or something. And I'm totally going off the cuff here. I didn't get a horoscope like that or anything, but I've just had those types of experiences with horoscopes and all that shit before, and I found them to be very, very valuable over time. The more that I'm willing to open to myself and see that everything that I'm perceiving in a particular reading or a horoscope or whatever is a reflection of myself, not what they're telling me that's correct and it's imposing on me, because this is all my power. When any spiritual practice you do, that's all your power. I mean, it's all of our power, but as God, but it's your power that you are giving to somebody. And so in my case, if I give the power to somebody and let them make me angry, what does that tell me about myself and the way that I engage with things? It's really valuable. And same with tarot. I've only done one tarot reading, I guess. I pulled 3 cards, and I did a past, present, and future. And I did something that my brother Sam he had a great way of doing it that was really fun, and I found to be really helpful. And I realized it's super potent if I allow it to be, which is the first card, the past card, and is how do you view the past through the lens of the present? Because everything is here now. Everything is present now. And so if I pull a card and say that's the past, then it is the way that I'm perceiving the past through the lens of the present. Because like I said, everything is present. And then there's the present. So how do I perceive the present through the present right now? And then how do I perceive the future through the present right now? So that can change at any time. And so then what's great about it is, how do I interpret the cards and feel like they are showing me something about myself or not? And either way, it's really valuable. It's a valuable spiritual practice and experience to have that conversation with yourself and witness your ego deal with this shit, because it's not meant to make objective sense. If it was meant to make objective sense, then, it'd be, there wouldn't be a lot of value to it, because it would be more like, I don't even know. It just wouldn't be even close. I mean, that's kind of why I wasn't into astrology for so many years of my life. I thought it was dumb, is because I thought it was all supposed to be objective. And that's definitely not the case. I mean, it's about recognizing that there's more going on that is bigger than yourself, and that in recognizing that there's more going on that's bigger than yourself, like, the way that things are affecting you from the outside, you realize that, oh, this is all my perception about how things are affecting me from the outside. And so I actually I give my power to these things to tell me what's going on within me, so that I then have a renewed and interesting relationship with myself through my spirituality. Anyway, I could go on and on. Maybe I'll do an episode at some point about astrology and tarot, and sort of like the ways in which in a contemporary society we are sort of engaging with our spirituality in interesting ways. That are certainly, I guess, in some circles controversial or piss people off, which, I mean, that's a fun opportunity to learn about yourself. So, that being said, this is a nice long episode, nearly an hour. What a great episode. Man, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of this. I hope it gave you the chance to think about something that's going on in your life and your incarnation and your practice that you find to be interesting. I hope it piques some interest. And so you say, oh, he talked about something there. What is that? Let me check that out. Whatever it might be. Lots of love to you. bless you. Thank you so much for being here, for listening. And yeah, check me out on Patreon, you know? Good stuff's going on there. I updated a lot with music, with graphics, with all this kind of shit. And it's been getting going. And yeah, and you know, ask me questions on there. And I'd love to just do like short little podcast things on there where we talk sort of in micro episodes or something like that. That'd be a lot of fun. So you can check me out there at patreon.com/jackintheway. It's always going to be that. But, oh man, what a good episode. With that, I love you. Thank you so much for being here. It is such a blessing to be able to share myself with you like this. I'm going to continue doing this. Eventually, I'm going to have guests. It's going to be a lot of fun. Okay? Here's to remembering who we are. Love you. Peace.